distant educational programs for at-large tribal members to promote cultural sustainability. I hope you enjoy. My name is Flint-Lowe, and I'm here to speak to you today about culture and the importance of cultural sustainability for tribal nations. As you may or may not know, I am currently enrolled at Southeastern Oklahoma State University in their Native American Leadership Program, and today's talk is an extension of that experience, so I thank you for coming. Speaking of the Native American Leadership Program, the program, their mission statement encourages students to identify difficulties facing tribal nations today and encourages them to find solutions for those problems, for which I see cultural sustainability as a pressing issue for Indian countries today. Cultural revitalization requires that we find new and innovative techniques. Otherwise, this will impact cultural sustainability because we will suffer, we will lose our unique culture, our ways of knowing for future generations. This is important to me as the mother of a 2-year-old. I feel it's important that I capture and understand my own culture so that I can educate him and that he can pass it on to his future generations. Speaking of culture, I think of a TED Talk that I was recently able to view, in which the presenter of Native American ancestry discussed culture. And he discussed culture as an extension of the word agriculture, meaning to grow. I began to think about this, and I started to think about culture a little differently, combining it with what I've learned in my Native American studies thus far. I began to think of culture differently. I had seen it as something static, stuck in the past, like a black and white photograph. But I began to see it as something living. And as with all living things, we must continue to nourish and provide it opportunity. Otherwise, it will cease to exist. Cultural revitalization is a deliberate, organized, and conscious effort by members of a society to construct a more satisfying culture. And cultural sustainability, which is my focus today, is capitalizing that as a generation, we take what our ancestors have taught us, we learn that, we adapt it, and we pass it on to our future generations so that our culture continues. Though it's beyond the limits of my discussion today, I do find it important that I speak of the cultural traumas faced by the Native Americans in the past. Cultural trauma is the result of cultural challenges, which over time result in cultural losses. Cultural challenges can be both positive and negative, but for the Native Americans, many of these challenges were negative and include epidemics of new disease, warfare, and competing belief systems. Essentially, upon first exposure, Europeans attempted conquest and colonialization and colonization in efforts to relocate, first of all. Then they tried to subjugate and eventually integrate Native Americans into their society. Over time, these continued cultural challenges resulted in cultural loss. Cultural losses, examples of cultural losses would be loss of cultural memory, loss of language, and loss of community. And this is where it becomes personal for me as well. As a member of the Porch Band and Creek Indians, this is the experience of our tribe being in Mobile near Pensacola. They were exposed to these the explorers, the conquest early on. Eventually overwhelmed, they had to disappear into the woods and hide until it was safe to come out. Essentially, they suffered attempted annihilation through assimilation and acculturation techniques. Many tribes have suffered cultural degradation due to loss of identity throughout the generations. As you can see from the chart, from first exposure to where we are today, historically, the Native Americans have been impacted more than any other ethnicity by non-Indian communities, and those impacts continue today. We know that currently it is common for Native Americans to leave the reservations for education and economic opportunity and due to intermarriage, and that 50% of Native Americans are of mixed ethnicities and they live a multicultural experience, and that we know that it's more common for Native Americans to disregard their traditional views of mainstream non-Indian cultural norms. But it's not all doom and gloom today. We're here to talk about revitalization, bridging the gap, local level activities to mitigate cultural loss. Revitalization movements build on indigenous cultural frameworks in innovative ways. They merge tradition and invention to meet the needs of the present moment. Currently, many Native American tribes, not all but most, are experiencing a success from gambling operations. They're using these monies to revitalize their culture. Language classes, traditional arts and crafts, traditional dance. At the Porch Panda Creek Indians, we have a very vital, active cultural community in which they put on an annual powwow in order to revitalize the dancing and the drumming. They have arts and crafts, which I was recently able to experience, as many of you have heard, where I got to weave do a weaving project. So it's not all bad. We are making waves. We're trying to revitalize this culture. But what are we missing? This is one of my favorite cartoons in which you can see 6 scientists, they're blindfolded, and they're looking at the elephant from their own perspective. They think they have it figured out, but they're missing the big picture, the elephant in the room. And when it comes to tribal culture and cultural sustainability, the elephant in the room is the tribal members living off the reservation. As we've already mentioned, it is not uncommon for tribal members to leave the reservation. Some resources say up to 70%. And that's the case of the Porch Panda Creek Indians. A large majority of our enrolled tribal base do not live on or within the vicinity of the reservation. So though we have all these great opportunities, a lot of us are missing out on those opportunities. And as we've mentioned before, so we're missing out on those opportunities. The lasting impacts of leaving the reservation. We know that moving off the reservation is detrimental to the cultural sustainability because it is reflected in the fact that those who leave find it very hard to go back and to rekindle their roots. We also know that such mobility, leaving the reservation, undermines the traditional communities and the role that extended families play for the tribe, and this impacts the collective security of the nation. Can you hear me now? The use of technology to connect distant tribal members. We've done so much to preserve the past. Why not ensure the future? Why not use technology? We're in the midst of the technological revolution, which has been promoting the rapid exchange of information. Therefore, we need to use these technologies because we know that successful revitalization movements are vitalistic at their core, and that they have to incorporate some form of foreign or alien element, for which I see technology as that element. Foreign to the traditional communities, but innovative. And therefore, we need to take these opportunities to educate the tribal base, adapting to ensure that Native culture and identity will endure. Cultural revitalization through distant education is a way to prevent further cultural losses using the available resources, infrastructure, and there is no reason we shouldn't initiate a distance-based education program, and I hope that you guys can agree. We need to utilize our technology. We have the financial resources for gaming operations. We have an at-large group that is already banded together through social media. We have a very prosperous online community, and there's a demand. We have to capitalize on the motivation that exists. People, the tribal members, want this technology. They want to be connected, and we need to capture missed opportunities. And by bridging current cultural immersion opportunities with the greater community, we are planting the seeds of culture for future generations. And we should remember, if we are to preserve culture, we must continue to create it. Thank you. The end.
The end. What's your way?